Hey, Joe Gilder here from HomeStudioCorner.com. Hope you're doing well. Thanks for being here. Today I want to talk about mixing kick drum and bass. I get this question a lot, and I'm not sure where it comes from, but hopefully by the end of this video, I'm going to simplify your thinking about mixing kick and bass and make it a lot easier. And the results will be a lot better. So the question I get a lot is, Joe, how do I mix kick drum and bass guitar in such a way that they don't conflict with each other? Or variations of that question would be, Joe, if the kick drum has a fundamental frequency at 60 hertz, should I go cut 60 hertz on the bass guitar so that the two don't conflict with each other? Or Joe, how do I keep the bass and the kick from being on top of each other? How do I get separation between the kick and the bass? Here's my take on it. You don't need separation between kick and bass. Okay? Just bear with me for a second. To my ears, and I was just doing a critique yesterday and I mentioned this, to my ears, the kick drum and the bass guitar are partners. They're essentially two separate things that I like to treat as equals. I don't really necessarily want kick and bass to be their own separate thing. They're a partnership, they're a team. And as such, I like to make them sound really similar. I don't want one to be completely devoid of certain frequencies that the other one has. Here's a good way to think about it. The kick drum is the punch. The kick drum is the thing that goes whoom, hits you in the chest when you hear it. The bass is the sustain of that punch. So if the kick drum goes boom, then I want the bass to go boom, frequency rise. Now I get the kick drum is going to have essentially the same frequency every time it hits, and the bass is going to change because he's going to be playing different notes. But tonally, that's the way I'm thinking about it, and that's what I'm trying to achieve in my mixes. I want the kick drum to have a nice big low end, not too much mid-range, and some snap in the top end so we can really pick that kick drum out over a dense mix. And then the bass, I want to also have a nice, rich, deep low end, not too much mid-range, and a little upper mid so we can also pick out the notes that are being played so it's not just a big wall of whoa, 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 but we can actually pick out some clarity when the bass player changes notes. Did you see what I did there? I described the kick drum sound and the bass guitar sound essentially the same way. That's the way I like to mix. That's what I think sounds good. I want the bass to have plenty of low end so it feels like a nice warm hug. I want the kick drum to also have plenty of low end so it's a nice punch in the face. Now obviously you don't want one to be a lot louder than the other. That was the case for that critique I was doing yesterday. The bass was nice and big and full. The kick drum was a little quiet. And that's why I didn't think it worked well. I wanted the kick drum to come up, and I also wanted it to have a little more low end and a little less of that kind of 100, 120 hertz frequency to where it was more boom, boom. That's what I'm hoping to hear out of a kick drum and a bass. Almost across the board, whatever genre has kick drum and bass in it, that's the sound that I'm going for. So hopefully I've challenged you on how to think about kick drum and bass. Remember, how we think about things is everything when it comes to making music. Yes, you need to learn how to use EQ and compression and whatever else to accomplish that sound in your software, but before you can even do that, you need to know what you're aiming for, and you need to have a better way of thinking about the process so then you can apply that better thinking in the real world. Does that make sense? Great example, me shooting this video, me running Home Studio Corner for 10 years. What camera I use is fairly irrelevant. What system I use to edit the videos doesn't really matter. What if I use a particular system for uploading and getting it onto YouTube doesn't really matter. What matters is that I'm thinking about these videos in the right way, and I'm making videos, making content that is helpful and that is what people want to hear and that brings value to the market, to you. Doesn't matter the system that I use. It matters that they're not crappy quality. It matters that I do a good job editing. It matters that I get it uploaded without any weirdness happening to the file. But what really matters, what matters first, is how I'm thinking, and then how that thinking translates to the content of the video, and then how that gets captured, edited, and distributed to the world. It's the same with music. It's the same with anything creative. Start here. Get your thinking better, and everything else will flow from that. Okay, enough theory for one day. Let's jump in and I'll practically show you how this works out on one of my mixes. All right, so here's the mix of my song Amen from my latest EP. By the way, if you want to mix this yourself, head over to duelingmixes.com. This is the song that we're mixing this month. And if you're watching this a few months or years in the future, you can go to duelingmixes.com, become a member, and access these tracks along with all the other songs we've mixed since way back in 2012. There's over 50, 70 songs. I can't even do the math. There's so many, each with a accompanying video from myself and Graham Cochran showing you how we mixed that month's song. If you want to mix, you want a lot of practice, but you also need some guidance along the way, Dueling Mixes is for you. There's a free trial. Head to duelingmixes.com and check that out. Okay, so here's how my mix sounds. I've muted the vocal so we can hear the instrument a little bit better. Here's the big wham. You can see this is called the wham section of the song. So with respect to the kick drum and the bass guitar, the kick drum is going boom, and we're feeling that in the low end. We're also hearing the tick, tick of the upper frequencies, the kind of mid-range frequencies of the kick drum. They're coming through. Take a listen to the kick drum. It's got a nice blend of a little bit of that tick and some low end there to give it a little bit of punch. And then the bass has a nice big low end to it. He's playing with a pick with some grit, so it has some upper mid-range to it. It also has a nice deep low end, and it's really carrying the low frequencies. Take a listen to that. Now, I'm going to show it to you in solo in just a second, but first thing I want to do is do the opposite. If you ever have a track or a group of tracks in your mix that are giving you problems, the best way to identify, first of all, if those are the actual source of the problems or not, isn't to solo them and listen to them, it's to actually mute them from the mix. And then you can decide, okay, I muted this, did the problem go away? Or I muted this and it lets me see what these tracks or this specific track was adding to the mix and if it's helping or hurting. So we'll start with the kick drum. I will start the playback and I'll mute the kick drum out, then I'll bring it back in. And we can notice what are we missing, and that helps us in a weird roundabout backwards way determine what the kick drum is adding to the mix. So I'll hit play, and then I will mute this bus here that has my two kick drum mics fed into it. So it's holding down the low end well. It's just a nice, it's not overwhelming, it's not huge amounts of low end, but a nice thump, and then a nice tick to kind of correspond with that. By itself, you can hear. It's exactly what I described earlier in the video. Some decent low end and some tickiness in the top end, okay? Now, let's do the same experiment with the bass. I'm gonna hit play and let it all ring out, and then I will mute the bass and listen to what leaves the mix when I take the bass away. The bass is a huge backbone to the mix. The kick drum is still a pretty big backbone, but I would say not as much as the bass. To me, the bass and the kick are playing this wonderful dance together where they complement each other. In this particular mix, the bass is probably carrying a little more of just the low end, doing a little more of the heavy lifting in the low end, and the kick is just accenting that with a little bit of punch and a little bit of snap up top. Here's the kick and bass together. Now, if you get the relationship between kick and bass right, you've probably done 50% of the work on a mix like this, because the low end is where a lot of folks have problems in their mixes. And if the low end is predominantly occupied by kick drum and bass guitar, if you get those two things right, you've handled a big portion of the mix. Let's take a listen. Here's a multiband. I'm not using this on the mix. It's just to allow me to let you hear this. Here's everything below 160 hertz. Let's see what we hear there. It's all kick drum, bass, and a little bit of snare, which I like, because I like a nice thick snare drum. But that's it. You can maybe hear a little bit of the guitars there. If there was a vocal, you would maybe hear a smidge of the vocal down in those low frequencies. But otherwise, everything that makes up the song other than kick and bass are more occupying these upper frequencies. But the low end stuff, that belongs to kick and bass. That doesn't mean you remove all low end from the other stuff. It just means this is where the bulk of the information is. So you want to get that right. That's why I very rarely will go take the fundamental of the kick drum and go cut that from the bass.
And I'll rarely use any side chaining, which I'll talk about in a future video, where I side chain the bass off of the kick drum. So whenever the kick drum hits, it turns the bass down. I've just never seen that as necessary for getting a good sound. They both complement each other well. A kick drum is naturally more punchy and more spiky than a bass. So it's going to cut through regardless if you do your job right in capturing it and then obviously in mixing it as well. Real quickly, so you can see what I did on this kick drum, all I did was boost the top end. That's it. We've got this kick in mic, which is really snappy. And then this sub kick mic that gives us the low end. Together by themselves, they sound like this. And then I use that EQ just to boost it a little bit more to make it a little snappy. So no compression on the kick drum. There's some compression on my drum bus, but none on the kick drum itself. Bass, same thing. I've got two bass tracks. One's a DI and one is an amp. That's the DI, got some grit on it. That's the bass, also has some grit on it and maybe a little bit more low end. I just blended them together, 50-50, sounds really great. And then I did a couple of things. I used some compression on the bass, an LA2A style compressor. And then a little bit of EQ, boosted up around 3K to get some of that grit to cut through. Took out a little bit of mid-range at 360, which again is exactly what I talked about earlier in the video. And then later in the mix, I put this EQ on there because there was just something kind of funky up in the 160 hertz range right in here. Ooh, ooh, ooh. That was just kind of annoying to me. So I turned it down. And that allowed for this nice deep low end to come through a little better and not be covered up by this 160 hertz kind of grossness that was happening there. And that's it. Really simple, nothing over the top, but that's how I make my bass and my kick drum play nicely together.
Thanks so much for watching this video. The goal here isn't to tell you that if you're not doing it this way, you're doing it wrong. Just to simply tell you if you feel burdened or overwhelmed by mixing kick drum and bass, chances are you're making it more complicated than it needs to be. A simple approach is oftentimes the best approach. At least that's what I found to be true. So I hope this gave you some ideas to try on your next mix. Let me know how it works, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.